Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I'm delighted to welcome you to a Nand and Jeet Khemka Distinguished Lecture hosted by CASI, the Center for the Advanced Study of India at the University of Pennsylvania. I'm Tariq Tachal, and I'm the director of CASI and a faculty member in the Department of Political Science here at Penn. Before introducing our distinguished speaker, I just want to thank the Nand and Jeet Khemka Foundation, whose generous support makes these series of public lectures possible. And I would also like to thank the CASI team responsible for organizing this event, Juliana, Georgette, Alan, Makeda, Laura, and Naveen. Thank you. The question animating today's Khemka lecture, why do so few Indian women work and what can be done about it, is both timely and timeless. There has been increasing awareness of a persistent paradox within India, as many of you know. The country's GDP per capita, recent controversies aside, has experienced steady overall growth over the past 3 decades, more than quadrupling between 1990 and 2015. Yet female labor force participation rates have remained stubbornly low, rarely crossing 35%. And in recent years, numerous labor surveys have unearthed evidence of a decline, with some putting the figure at closer to between 24 and 28%. Growth might trigger initial declines in female labor force participation as incomes rise and women drop out of low-paying and menial jobs, particularly in agriculture. But these trends are typically expected to reverse with continued increases in development and education levels, as India has witnessed. Why then has growth not been accompanied by more women working or seeking work? Why does India lag behind other countries at a similar level of economic development, including neighbors like Nepal and Bangladesh? Addressing these questions is important given the importance of women working for their own financial well-being, social autonomy, and even physical health. But it is also important for the country's economic health, with some estimates suggesting a net increase of over 25% of India's GDP if the gender gap in labor force participation were to be closed. To advance our understanding of this important phenomenon, I can think of no person better than our speaker, Rohini Pande, who has spent years seeking to understand the barriers to India's women entering the workforce and thinking about ways to dismantle these barriers. Professor Pande is Henry J. Heinz II Professor of Economics at Yale University, where she also directs the Economic Growth Center. She was previously Rafiq Hariri Professor of International Political Economy at Harvard University, where she also co-founded the research group Evidence for Policy Design. As one of the world's foremost development economists, she has contributed to our understanding on a range of topics within political economy. In work with a range of collaborators, she has examined the impact of microfinance, providing the first evidence of the adverse consequences of a lack of a grace period for borrowers. She has looked at how tenancy reform in Indian landholding can reduce local landowning inequality, but also increase landlessness among SC and ST households. In other work, she has looked at how favoritism towards elder sons underpins India's alarming levels of child stunting. Her research has often looked to inform public policy and is designed in conjunction with policymakers at the central, state, and local levels, both in India and elsewhere. Her work often looks to test innovative ways to make the state more accountable to its citizens, understand how state institutions shape patterns of privilege and disadvantage, and design policies to strengthen economic and political opportunities for women. However, I do not want to read out a list of accomplishments as is often pro forma in these kinds of introductions. Instead, I'd like to conclude by noting just one achievement that I think is perhaps most significant. For it suggests that unlike many academics, Professor Pande does not view the US academy she works within as insulated or above the problems that she studies, in particular the structural disadvantages faced by women. Even more importantly, she has been seriously committed to improving the representation of women within the still heavily male-dominated profession of economics. According to a 2018 special report published by the American Economic Association, women make up just 14% of full professors within US economics departments. It is therefore especially notable that in 2018, Professor Pande was awarded the Carolyn Bell Shaw Award for promoting the success of women in the economics profession. And her letters of nomination attest to her constant efforts to advocate for female economists, some of whom said they would have left the profession entirely if not for her support and advocacy. We are very sorry to not be able to host Professor Pande here in Philadelphia in person, but we are delighted she has agreed to join us virtually. Given that the focus of today's lecture is on inclusion, we at CASI are aware that this virtual format does permit many of you to attend who might otherwise not be able to do so, including many students in India who registered for today's talk and whom we especially welcome. To all of you listening, if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A box, and I will pose as many of them as I am able to Professor Pande following her talk. With that, please join me in welcoming Professor Rohini Pande, our Fall 2020 Khemka Distinguished Speaker. Rohini, welcome.
Thank you, Tariq. So thank you very much for that very warm welcome, and I'm extremely honored to be here and have the opportunity to talk to you. So let me jump into my presentation without more ado. Great. So, as Tariq said, what I wanted to talk about today was really some learnings that we've had over the years on thinking about how do you design policy to affect women's ability to work in settings where power relations matter a lot. And this is really going to be a central theme in my discussion. Before I start, I should say that this work is based on joint publications and joint papers with many co-authors. I've listed some of my main collaborators over the years here, but it's also been made possible by sort of tireless work by many young researchers who joined us in the field over the years. So this is also thank you to many of them for all they've done here. So as Tariq mentioned, on many dimensions, Indian women's lives have been improving. So if you look at GDP or female education or fertility, we see the trends look very positive. And it's worth remembering that not that long ago, maybe just 3 decades ago, these were often seen as important precursors that should bring about women's empowerment. The idea that educating women was seen as an incredibly important way of empowering women. But when you look at the data on women's work, we don't see such a positive trend on working outside the household. So what this graph shows you is each dot is a country, and it shows you for 3 points in time. 1990 is the gray line. The yellow is for 2000, and the maroon is for 2010. It shows you how female labor force participation varies with the country's income. And the big dots below the line in gray, yellow, and maroon are India. And you can see that in each of the cases, India has been getting richer, so the dots are moving to the right, but they remain persistently and stubbornly below the regression line. And so even if we took to heart, as Tariq said, the view that women first leave the labor force when countries become richer, because not everyone now needs to work, and then re-enter, in all cases, we see that Indian women are just working a lot less. One way of trying to think about what's going on is to really add another variable. And this is something that Marianne Bertrand, an economist who's been working on female labor force participation across the world, did in an AEA lecture this year. She took data from the World Values Survey, which was a question that asked, when jobs are scarce, do you agree that men have more of a right to a job than women? And asked if she divided countries into sort of higher, middle, and lower sexism by it, does it predict the extent of the curve? And the answer was yes. Unfortunately, even in that case, you see that India lies well off the regression line, but this starts giving you a sense of one thing that may be going on is that perhaps what keeps women out of the labor force is not just higher income at low level when you start growing, but perhaps also something more structural. And indeed, this harks back to work by Esther Bose-Roop, which she had done in the early 1970s, where she argued that times of structural transformation could also easily become points in time when women get marginalized. So as an economy starts growing and you start seeing manufacturing sector and the services sector rise, in the start, they don't have that many jobs. And in the queue to move out of agriculture and get into these sectors, it may well be that women are left behind in the queue, partly because of norms such as the idea that men have more of a right to a job. Now, one important thing to keep in mind is that this is not pushing back against, say, cultural differences. If we think of just survey data, in the National Sample Survey, what we see that around 30% of Indian housewives state that their preference is to have a job. So if we simply brought these latent workers into the labor force, responding to their preferences to be in the workforce, we would actually double the female labor force participation. And so a recurrent theme of the work I'm going to talk about today is to really think about what are these norms, these social informal institutions that can either be directly internalized by women or indirectly channeled by men and lead to women staying out. One way in which it's indirectly channeled is this quote from someone in one of our sites who said, "Every man's responsibility is to take care of his family. A good husband can take care alone." And this is a case where you may think that these norms are actually become sources of stigma if you move against them. So in my short talk today, what I wanted to do first is just give you a few facts about Indian women's work lives and point out the ways in which they look very different from what we see in other countries. I then want to talk about how we should think about designing policy in a world where controlling resources matters and where power matters. And then finally, I want to just leave with some thoughts of the concerns I think many of us have on what might be happening to India's women in a post-COVID world or right now during a COVID world. So I'm going to talk about 5 facts which come from the most recent labor force survey, the periodic labor force survey of 2018-19. So this was before the COVID crisis. The first fact that's extremely striking is in India, what we see is a lack of entry rather than exit for women in the labor force. So what you see in this graph, the top line, the blue line is for men. You can see that men steadily enter the labor force from, say, the age of 16 up to 28, at which point close to 95% of men are working. And then that remains steady until they start retiring after the age of 50. In contrast, you see for women, it starts at a much lower level. It continues to rise till later, till around the age of 40, but it remains extremely low. And this is in stark contrast to many other countries where what we see is women enter the labor force, stay in it until childbirth causes many of them to leave and they may enter again. So in the Western world, often the conundrum of female labor force participation is often the M shape, the fact that it's entry, exit, and then re-entry to a lower level. In contrast, in India, what we're seeing is they're just not entering the labor force. And consistent with this, what you see here is for each age, from the age of 18 to 40, the purple line at the bottom, so let's look at women on the left-hand side. The purple line at the bottom shows you the number of women who are unmarried and studying. And the yellow line at the top shows you the number of women who are married, neither studying nor working. And then the pink line below that is unmarried, neither studying nor working. And what you see is, say up till the age of around 21, there's roughly division is half between those who are married, not working, and then those who are unmarried either in school or not working. But then the transition really mostly is from being unmarried, not working, to married, not working. In contrast, if you look at men, they are similarly in education at the ages of 18 and 19, but then after that, what expands out for them is the orange bars, which are the married working, and that is just not happening for women. And this is happening against the background of increasing education among women. And so unsurprisingly, if you look at education, what we see that education remains a very limited predictor of work, especially in rural areas. So this is looking at men and women between the ages of 25 to 60, so they mostly finished education. And what you can see is for men, which is the blue line, the bars are very low. So they've entered work. In contrast, for women, the bars are very high of not being in work, and they're essentially not really moved by education. There is, I should say, some evidence that in urban areas, women with more than secondary do seem to be participating more in the labor force. And I'd argue this gives us a little bit of a hint of what's going on here. So women are getting more educated. They're moving out of agriculture with education. In urban areas, they have some ability to enter, say, service sector or manufacturing. In the rural area, those jobs are just not there. And that combined with mobility restrictions, which means that migration is difficult for young unmarried women to undertake, means that you end up remaining at home, being educated, but not working. You can see that here. So here I've just taken the group of rural and urban women who have more than secondary education, and then taken the dark blue part of the pie on the left, which is the fraction employed. So among secondary school educated women in rural area, 13% are employed, and in urban areas, 20% are employed. And then asked to see where are they employed. So obviously rural women are more likely to be in agriculture, but you see manufacturing is quite similar across rural and urban areas. And this is consistent with the fact that in India, a lot of recent economic growth has been services driven, not manufacturing driven. But the big difference that you see is that urban women are much more likely to be in services. So the largest, interestingly, one of the largest sectors where more educated women enter is education as school teachers. And then what you see is health workers. And then there's this group of other services, which is retail work, working in hotels and beauty salons and so on. And that's really a sector that is much more accessible to urban women than rural women. And so I think part of what it will take for women to enter the labor force is for rural women to be able to migrate at much higher rates to urban areas. And one thing to remind you is, so one thing we'll be talking about is norms and how they may be limiting migration. But another fact that I will just highlight is the contractual status for women is very poor in services and manufacturing. So this shows you that if I look at manufacturing, services, health, and education, essentially the vast majority are working with no written contract, or if they have a contract, it's for less than a year. Education is the best place. There's a lot of public sector there, so you're more likely to have a longer term contract. So while we talk quite a lot about norms, I do want to recognize that another constraint on women's work, especially when it comes to migration, is that you're migrating for work that is where you have very little protection. So let me turn now to what I see as one of the key constraints that is unique in a lot of ways to South Asia, and in particular to India. So before we start talking about the importance of norms, it may be useful to align on the concepts that we're going to use. So when I talk about actual norms, I'm going to be talking about the beliefs that a social group holds about what is or is not appropriate behavior. So this might be my own belief on whether it's appropriate for a woman to work, or whether I think a woman who works is undertaking activities that are not appropriate for her. The second notion is perceived norms. So this is not my own belief, but this is my perception of what the community thinks. And you may think that this is what we think underlines concepts of stigma. So this is an individual's perception of others' beliefs of what you think may be appropriate. And interestingly, there's a lot of work recently saying that especially in economies that have seen sudden large increases in, say, education, actual and perceived norms may not be aligned, and in particular your perceptions may be much more conservative than actual individuals' preferences are. One of the things that I've tried to do in quite a lot of my work with my co-authors is to try to measure separately these norm costs based by men and women, and to argue that gender norms don't just vary at the level of country or community, but they also have important differences across men and women. And this is what very often becomes the basis of power asymmetries that then play out in women being constrained in work by not their preferences, but those of their husbands. And you can see this is data from our study site in Madhya Pradesh. And what you see here is this is for the individual perceptions of the share of the community that judges a woman if it works. The hollow bars are female reports, so those are women's survey reports, and the shaded in bars are men reports. And what you can see is that the entire male distribution is shifted to the right of the female distribution. And so what we see is men see much greater social cost to female works, and if you run just simple correlations, typically this correlates with fewer women working. So that, I think, is the most direct form of these norms, which is inappropriateness of working. So where are these norms about appropriateness of work coming? A lot of them are actually coming from what you believe is relevant in for marriage. So as part of some work we were doing on mobile phone ownership by women, we did a lot of data collection around these norms. And these are typically the type of norms and the implications they have, which then matter for work. So pre-marriage, the typical norms are that girls should remain chaste and pure, and this translates into limited physical mobility, limited access to mobile phones. Then there are views that girls should be subservient and obey parents in order to ensure that arranged marriages within caste networks can occur, and this will lead to limited decision-making power, often of who you marry. Post-marriage, the fact that women live with their in-laws often leads to weaker social ties and therefore a harder ability to negotiate. And then there's a perception that the primary role is that of a caregiver. Let me give you an example of how this actually shows up when we start thinking about aspects of the modern economy that might matter for work. So as I said, with some of my co-authors, we did a number of qualitative interviews of roughly around 100 women and 27 men about phone ownership, whether it was appropriate for women to own phones and how this mapped to gender norms. So you can see that this is a very typical thing we would hear is that, women are caregivers, so they should not use their phones for long hours. Purity was very important, that phones are seen as a risk to a woman's reputation. She might, especially as an adolescent, go and get a partner, a boyfriend. But you want to ensure that, phones are okay if they're for work or study, but the bigger concern was how is it going to affect your reputation? And in fact, this is one of the reasons why India has the largest gender gap in mobile phone usage across the world, even though it has some of the cheapest mobile phone rates. So now let me start trying to relate these notions of norms to what it means in terms of work. So the first part of evidence I want to talk about is really descriptive evidence from a large survey we did of rural men and women who entered skilling programs. So this is a very common current government program of trying to provide training to men and women. So it's usually a 6 to 8 week training, at the end of which you're placed in a job. So if you think about, say, someone working Coffee Cafe Day in Bangalore, there may be someone who has been trained in skilling institute in, say, Madhya Pradesh, and then sent to provided this job contract in Bangalore. Another very common one would be government workers who, say, get trained in Orissa and then sent again near Bangalore for work. So we took a set of these, roughly 2,000 of these trainees across 7 rural North Indian states and asked, what does the pipeline look like? So we compare men to women. And so if you look at the bottom up on these bar charts, what you see, roughly 15% of the men did not receive a job offer at the end of their skill training. And this almost doubles for women. So there's and this is despite having very similar grades. So this is, I think, this idea when jobs are scarce, who gets them more. But then you also find that women refuse these jobs at a slightly higher rate. And as a net result of it is that they're much less likely to get placed with an actual job. And so then when we interviewed men and women on the reasons for the job rejection, what was very striking is that the predominant reason for men was wages, that the wages were not high enough or they had other work-related concerns. For women, the primary concern was personal and family concerns, that their parents would not like them to go far away, that it would affect the marriage, and that essentially it was always repeatedly the same thing. I really want to go, but my parents won't let me go. And so I think the striking difference in the reasons for job rejection, again, brings out the importance of norms. So let me turn to some slightly more cheerful thoughts of how can we design policies that can actually work at a time. So this is actually this is a picture from our study site, and what you see here is it's a set of women who have come to take up work as daily laborers in the field. They're going to be helping harvest the wheat, and the rates at which they're going to work are being negotiated between the landowner and their husbands. And so this is a very common setting where women are working, but the rates at which they're working and who gets the money is their husband. And so we were very interested in this basic question is, can the government affect change by changing who gets money when the woman works? And to remind you, the setting against which this matters is that, India is really today the world leader in digitizing social protection payments. So there's a huge opportunity of asking whether you can empower women in terms of at least control of their earnings through these digital social protection programs. And what we're going to be looking at is the National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme, which is the world's largest federal workfare program at this time. As you can see, there are over 113.5 million accounts under this scheme. So as I said, this policy guarantees 100 days work at a fixed wage to any household that requests employment. It's a particularly salient policy to be looking at right now because in the kind of COVID world, this has really turned out to the main form of social protection available to individuals in rural areas. We worked in rural northern Andhra Pradesh in a set of village clusters, and this was an area with relatively conservative norms, and our sample was where at least one household member was working for the workfare, but the woman was unbanked. And the problem we were interested in that in these households where a woman is unbanked, even if she works, the payments were being digitally transferred, but to her husbands. And so the first intervention that we were interested in was to say, let's just give women bank accounts. They can then do what they want with it, but we will just give them bank accounts. And this is a typical village kiosk that you would see in our study areas. The second was to say, let's strengthen this account by also providing them some training and in particular helping them understand how they can use the kiosk, how they can go in and affect outcomes. But the third one, which is really the one we're the most interested in, was for a subset of them to request accounts to be linked to their payments in the NREGA system. And so this meant that their earnings would go to their own account and would not change anyone else's. So just to summarize, we ran a randomized field experiment. So we randomized at the level of the villages, which group you came into. And the main results that I'm going to be interested in today is comparing women who got a bank account, so got some financial inclusion, to those who got the bank account, training, and direct deposits. So we're really interested in asking is, holding constant the ability to have a bank account, does giving a woman control over her earnings have an additional effect? So there are high levels of take-up. People are very interested in this account. But importantly for us, we tracked outcomes at 2 points, so 1 year after and 3 years after. And we find that what this did do is it raised labor supply. So we find significant increases in both public labor supply, which perhaps is less surprising that you may expect once people have more awareness. But what's very important for us is we actually see increases in private labor supply. And that, more than anything else, we argue, is consistent with the idea that there are groups of women who were constrained from entering the labor market because of their husband's internalization of norms that working was a source of stigma. Once they were able to control their earnings, they had more bargaining power. They were able to start working. And once they start working, they would not restrict themselves to the public labor sector. They would work in both the public and the private sector. Alongside what we see is that financial inclusion and autonomy improves as well. These are 3 different measures. We see effects on account use, kiosk knowledge, and importantly, banking autonomy, which is perceptions on whether a woman visits a bank alone and is comfortable doing so, and whether she believes this is appropriate. Now, 3 years after the intervention, we went back to these villages. We knew by now that our intervention had led to more women working. What we were interested in is, does this actually lead to a liberalization of norms? So we first about our actual norms. So we asked, did this change views on whether a woman should be able to work, whether you want your son or a daughter to end up in a household where women work? Does it affect your approval of working men and women? And here what we found is that these norms liberalized, but they liberalized largely for women, not for men. Next, we looked at perceptions. So here what we did is we gave every surveyed individual, man and woman, a set of 10 coins and asked them to tell us how many of these coins do they think represent the number of community members who would not speak badly of working women. And similarly, who would not think badly of a husband. And here what we found is that perceptions improved, both for women, but importantly also for men. And we think that this in the end was perhaps the most positive source of potential long-term change, that this changed men's beliefs of how much stigma they would face in their community if their wives went out and worked. So let me spend the last few minutes, 4 minutes or so of my talk, talking a little bit about what I see are the big risks for women today as the pandemic and the economic recession in India continues. And so the question I think many of us are trying to think about is, what is this crisis going to do? Is it going to be a point of change where men start picking up more housework, we start seeing more alignment of men's recognition of the care economy? Or is this going to become a case of reinforcing social norms and labor market inequalities that even get more exacerbated? So for the first thing you should look at is the two bars on the left. So this is the World Values Survey question. When jobs are scarce, men have more right to a job than women. And as you can see here, 61% of the men and actually close to 50% of the women agree with this statement. So we are entering the pandemic, if you will, with in a setting where the norms already suggest that there may be a belief that women have less rights to a job. And then we ended up in one of the deepest recessions in the world. So according to recent IMF estimates, India's per capita growth rate for 2020 is going to be minus 11%, and it expects to add close to 85 million to its poverty rolls. And then the most recent reports, which is from the Center for Monitoring the Indian Economy, which is really the main, I think I'd say in real time measure we have of employment, is we conditional on employment pre-lockdown. We are seeing a 23.5% difference between men and women's employment post-lockdown. So in this setting, what should social policy do? At the time of the lockdown, the main policy that the government implemented was to really give very short-term cash transfers. And they hoped that these would be gender sensitive by saying that we're going to put them into the bank accounts women with PMJDY accounts, which are these bank accounts very similarly to experience in Madhya Pradesh that were opened at scale in what the Indian government would call mission mode. So the first thing we showed in just existing data is that, the women who need it the most tend not to have accounts. And this is exactly this issue. They're less literate, they don't have mobility concerns, their husbands may not approve of them having an account. And so our estimates, which seem to then match up with actual banking data, is that roughly half of women below a World Bank Poverty Index were excluded from this cash relief because they didn't have it. The next thing one could ask is, well, what happened under NREGA? So we go back to our study setting, and what this graph on the right shows you, the blue line is the average employment under NREGA of 2015 to 2019. And then the red line shows you this year. And you can see it's been a tremendous spurt. This has been the main form in which rural households are getting any livelihood right now. So we went back and got the data on our study areas and looked to see, did those households where, or did those women who actually have gotten the bank account with the direct transfer do better? And what we see is, which is good news for us, is that this graphs out, the light blue line is the accounts only people. And then the dark blue line is, if you want, the treatment I talked about, direct deposit training. And the graph marks out both when the national lockdown began and then when it ended. And what you can see is that there is kind of a little bit of an expanding, but certainly a steady difference in the rates in which women who had direct deposits and training, who lived in villages with now somewhat liberalized norms and who had an ability to use their accounts, were able to cope with the pandemic by going out and working. So that's one response to say, I mean, it's a bit of a longer term response, but it's not just about saying you're going to put money into women's accounts. Implementation matters, understanding who are the women who actually are able to access these accounts, and working on longer term agendas to ensure that there is active financial inclusion is going to be for women as important as just going to be, say, rolling out Aadhaar. Let me finish with one last slide, which I have two slides as the second last slide, which is really on return migration. So World Bank estimates suggest that during the lockdowns, there was something like 40 million internal migrants who were affected by these lockdowns. So along with some of my colleagues, we've been tracking a representative sample of male and female return migrants in Chhattisgarh and Bihar. These are low education migrants and young. The median age in our sample is 28. what we so we track them when they return to these states, and so they return from all over, often South India, sometimes North India. We find that there are now large gender gaps in working at the return place. And perhaps what's concerning is that the stated plans to return migrate again to higher paying work in urban areas is much higher for men than for women. And so at least right now in the data, what we see is women look like they're going to be less likely to return to urban areas than migrant labor. And there's also some evidence that for the unmarried female migrants who returned, they're more likely to get married at a slightly earlier age than they would have otherwise. And so let me just conclude with sort of three thoughts. So I've argued that thinking about labor force for participation of women in India has to be linked to thinking about gender norms and marriage markets. We see in many different ways that women and men bear social costs when women work. And some of these costs are linked to perceptions of what sustains purity and what is appropriate for young women who need to then get married within their same caste. In this setting, there is, however, a potential for creating some kind of a virtuous cycle where if you strengthen women's control over economic resources, in the longer run, norms are malleable, they can change. This is something we've seen the world over, and so India is no different here. But I think right now is particularly a time of concern. This is a time where the women's labor market positions are greatly threatened. And so I think the response can't just be to say we are going to target cash transfers to women. It has to really try to take on much more of these norms and power structures which are going to be actively suggesting that women come later in the queue relative to men when it comes to entering the labor force. So let me stop here. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks so much, Rohini, for a broad-ranging and stimulating talk. Just to remind everyone, please enter any questions that you have into the Q&A box. I know that there are a number there already, and I apologize in advance if we're not able to get to all of them, but hopefully we'll be able to get through a few. So let me begin by asking a question that came from Milan Vaishnav, who asked Rohini that he notes that there seems to be a consensus that conservative/patriarchal norms hamper women's labor force participation. But his question is about the supply side, and particularly about the lack of supply of suitable jobs that are proximate to women's residences, matching their skills, that fit with their schedules, things like part-time work. I know, you talked about this in the context of Narega, which is a specific idea, but, how do you think about this set of constraints more broadly in terms of the work that you're doing?
So I think, you can respond to these constraints in two ways. And I should say, I keep changing my mind on which way one should respond. So one way to, so what's not happening in India, I think the clearest thing is rural to urban migration for women. So if you look at China in the 1990 or the 2000 census, one of the largest groups that was migrating was young unmarried women between 16 to 20 going to the coastal areas to work in garment firms. So as I said, I go both ways in that I think one view is to say what we really need to do is make migration safer, more appropriate. And I didn't present this, but one piece of evidence we see very strongly is that migration support centers in the cities, the better they are in terms of, say, getting your bank account, getting your mobile phone, getting paperwork, the longer women are likely to stay in the job. So there's one view that what you really want to do is work on trying to make migration available. The other, which can happen if women are very important for work, is that the industries themselves move. So you hear a little bit about that for the garment industry, where there have been examples of some industries actually opening up in Orissa, where a lot of the labor is, because they find it harder to get in Karnataka. The third is very much to say, let's think about what are the jobs women can do in the village. So for instance, if they're bank kiosks, well, maybe we should require female women to be in charge of bank kiosks. I said I sort of have a mixed view on that. I think it's important to take small steps. So I agree that, you want to find jobs. But I worry that in doing that a bit, we are doing exactly what Esther Bostrup said, is that we're marginalizing women into these particular types of jobs that, will get you into the labor force, but don't have the career progression that going to a city and starting an urban life has. So I think we should increase that, but we should be careful to do it in a way that ensures that we're not actually having supporting this marginalization of the jobs women have.
Thanks for that. So another question that we have comes from Manasi Rao, who asks, how does childcare factor into this phenomenon? So we would expect that having access to childcare would increase the number of women in the workforce. But India has a large share of joint families, which doesn't really reap the benefits of additional family members available for childcare. So I think the broader question is, just this idea of this additional responsibilities of women, how does that kind of play a role here?
So I think there's no doubting that women play an important role, and I would say it's the broader care economy. It's not just childcare. So India has just released a new time use survey, I think after like 20 years. And you see very clearly that it's both childcare, it's also other work. But I think that's the reason why the first fact I showed about women in work in India is it really is striking. It's not about exit at the time of having kids. Women are not entering the labor force. They're not entering the labor force. They're going from being unmarried and not working to being married, not working. So I think once they start working, I have no doubt that childcare will be an important constraint. And I suspect if you cut the data, which we should do, and look at, let's say, urban more than secondary women, secondary education women, we'll start seeing a little bit of the M shape. But for the vast majority of women right now, I think what's constraining is not being able to enter the labor market.
Next question is from Harsha Tirumurthy. So he asks, how outside the context of research studies, has there been or is there likely to be opposition by men in rural communities or for their female partners receiving bank accounts and the necessary training? And certainly, we can think of kind of instances of backlash and to similar moves, perhaps. I remember a study in Bangladesh with respect to microfinance. And so, are there institutions that are ideally suited to providing this training? Harsha wants to know, so your thoughts on that.
So I think, I think there's certainly evidence that there are groups that don't want power structures to be changed. Very often these are actually going to come from outside your household. So one thing we saw, I think in some rural economies, and I know people like Ellen Barry wrote about it quite a lot, is that it's actually along caste lines, not so much men versus women in the same family. If I'm a poor, lower caste household, very often, just the income requirements mean that I would be happy to have my wife go out and work. But these notions of purity and so on come very often from upper castes who, in order to maintain, ensure that there are very few intercaste marriages, push against women working. So I think I think there is backlash very often and there is opposition. I completely agree. But sometimes the quotas are not so much of just a husband saying they don't want their wife to work. It interacts with income. Another thing we saw, which I was very struck by when we did this skills survey, we surveyed both parents and brothers. And one thing we saw is actually very often parents were not so opposed to their daughters going to urban areas. These were, illiterate parents. And, there's this parental affection for their daughter. If their daughter pushes hard enough, they want to go. But in many cases, we found that brothers had much more conservative social norms. This could also just be a trend of kind of increasing conservatism in India that's going on. But it was very often, you could say, and in many views, it could be that their brothers have a better sense of the dangers of them going. It could be that their brothers are competing with them in the labor market, and so they don't want them to go. Or it could just be a rise in conservatism. But we actually saw for these women, it was the brothers who were often the gatekeepers.
So I think a question that we've got from a couple of people and kind of dovetails with something that I was thinking about is, and since you touched on caste, the idea of how much of this is inflected by caste differences even between women. I'm thinking of the recent Time Use survey that actually shows some difference between upper caste and SC/ST women in terms of the amount of paid work that they do. So female upper caste actually do about half as much paid work as more disadvantaged caste communities. And so just thinking about the role of caste, in a lot of the work you're doing, including the effects of some of this job training and skill acquisition, employers perhaps discriminating between women on caste lines. I mean, it could be many different dimensions. I'm sure you've thought about it. But, if any of the work that you've done, speaks to that.
So the thing that I don't know, and I would love to hear, so in case there's any graduate students thinking of areas to work on, I think it'd be very interesting to see it from the employer's perspective. I would say in general, we know that there is caste discrimination, we know there's gender discrimination, but we actually don't know a lot about how these interact. And I don't know much about it. I'd say certainly in the settings in kind of rural India where we worked with the NREGA workers, they tend to typically be, I would say, OBC, SC, and ST. Upper caste actually are rarely part of that market to start with. So I think that's actually that would be the hardest group to start thinking about how do you move. I have a couple of graduate students who I think one thing that they've been working on, which is interesting, is looking at sort of spillover of norms actually from scheduled tribes to other general caste. So it's, I think a lot of people talk about the Sanskritization that happens, but they find some evidence that if you have a large enough number of, say, tribal women, you might see what becomes more acceptable as women's work.
You've mentioned the importance of, I'm again fielding a couple of different questions that have come in. So, you've mentioned the impact of the potential kind of impact of migration and female migration and the need to maybe have policies designed to encourage and protect women migrants. But I was wondering, whether you think that that's actually feasible. I mean, even for men, a lot of, male migrants in cities face quite hostile and exclusionary conditions within Indian cities. And, thinking about the kind of migrant crisis triggered post-COVID. So, while that may seem, kind of a theoretically valuable exercise, do you think that it's actually kind of practical in a policy perspective to think about making women, making cities safe for Indian women migrants? And I don't know if, a couple of examples come to mind for you on that.
So the one thing we did a little bit of work on, we unfortunately remained at the stage of a pilot, is what it built on was something that I remember when I was growing up in India was very vivid to me. It was working women hostels. And so actually, if you look at the data in the 1960s, there's a lot of investment by the Indian government in working women hostels. And one of the things I keep coming back to is, and I think this was talked about a while ago, is that actually one piece of land that the Indian government still has a lot of access to is actually the textile ministry. From old textile mills and so on, is they actually have access to land in cities and areas where they could actually be building a lot more women working women hostels. So I think, in some ways, I think if you created those hostels, and I think especially if they were done by the state, which I think still has a lot of ability to make people feel confident about it, you would get women coming. I think otherwise, the other things that would be useful is, just right now there's very little information that families have about the kind of place where their child is going. And so one thing we saw, again, in some of our work in Orissa is you would literally have one story, or true or not, of, let's say, trafficking from a district, and all the villages will shut down and say no one from our village is going to go. Among girls. So I think there's value to improving the information. How far that'll go is always a question, but I think you can hope that certainly some of these things in terms of just providing safer conditions at destination and this much. The other thing, which is I believe a lot in the state, but I actually think this may be a place where the private sector can be leveraged quite well. So if you think about it, at the top end, if you think of the Infosys or the others, and they've really led skills training at the end of really high-end technology, you definitely see them entering right now in government industries. So you see some of it. But I think, again, rather than having these skilling institutes completely run by public sector as it's done right now, I think introducing the private sector, and the private sector has points where they are actually very interested in having female workers. You might find them actually being willing to invest as well.
I'll ask one more question on this before that's come in before moving to a different topic. So this is a question from Rachel Brule, who asks, is there a way in which the particularly high volume of male reverse migration may actually encourage women not to compete with men for jobs in local rural economies, and counterintuitively actually encourage them to migrate at higher levels in the post-pandemic future? And she doesn't ask this, but it might be, more local patterns of migration, maybe not interstate, but, intrastate, which is a big part of migration in India. So just putting that there.
So I think the one place where we have actually tried to look a bit at this is to see whether there's been crowd out in NREGA work, because that's really the main place I think where you see it. I think the return migrants who are coming back right now, they're mainly turning to NREGA in the very short run. And, just to remind you, a place like Kerala, NREGA was close to 80% female activity because of the extent of out-migration, say, to the Gulf and other places in Kerala. So we see some small dips. So there is some evidence of crowd-out, but it's not huge right now. I think the main problem is, I think NREGA remains a sort of rationed program. So, but I think there's some small evidence of that. Now, whether this will cause women to leave really depends on how much agency they have. And I think certainly in some parts of rural North India I work, I'm not that optimistic that they have that much agency. I think the more the concern is that it's going to lead to a lot of increase, for instance, in marriage rates among younger girls.
Let's turn maybe to a couple of questions on variation, within kind of geographical variation. So, you talk a little bit about, and there has been some conversation about differences between North and South India, although some of your empirical work has a North Indian focus, but I know, you've thought about this. And this is kind of combining questions we've got from Shahana and from Varsha Rao, which is really thinking a little bit about, why is it that we see this stickiness of norms within India? Even if we compare with Bangladesh, with Sri Lanka, within South Asia, let alone other countries, we see different rates of female labor force participation rate. Is that due to underlying differences in norms, in patriarchal norms? Have you kind of, thought or read about this, and what explains that kind of cross-national variation and maybe even some of the sub-national variation within India?
Yeah, I think this is a hard question in that, I think, economists love taking over everything and saying that we can speak better to it than any other discipline, but this may be one where I suspect, I'd say sociologists and political scientists may do a better job than I would. I think that one thing to me that is really striking as an economist is how little education has mattered. Like if you talk to the average economist right now, they will say in economist language, the returns to women from education are in the marriage market. Which is sort of a crazy way of saying is we can't actually explain where, why they're not working. And so, they're getting a lot of education, they're not working. So it must be as the outside option where it is. So I think that to me is perhaps the way I think indirectly we get the clearest evidence that something like norms is going on, is that you're giving them the skills they need, and there's a lot of education there, but they're just not being able to enter the labor market. And certainly I think a lot of surveys of adolescent girls or young teenagers suggest that at the time when they're being in education, they are looking forward to working. So it's not as if there isn't a desire among that group to work. I think turning to the cross-state variation, one thing I think is worth noting is I talked about how more educated women are, seem to work at slightly higher rates in urban areas, but overall urban female labor force participation rates are below rural labor force participation rates. So I think that's again something which suggests that perhaps sometimes constraints like safety or even childcare may be more salient in urban areas. But and I think the reason I bring it up is that that's a place actually where the South-North breakdown stops. So if you look, for instance, in Karnataka, the lowest female labor force participation rates are in the district of Bangalore and actually the city of Bangalore to a large extent. In Delhi, surveys suggest labor force participation of women is between 20 to 25%. So I think there's a lot of rural variation that you can explain by the typical North-South division on conservative social norms. But where it breaks down is when you look at urban North Indian areas and urban South Indian areas. There you just see low participation.
As we wrap up, a couple of questions on kind of looking at alternative kind of channels of influence. So one set of questions we've got, including from Viola Asri, asks about, the feasibility of targeting men. So if men's, social norms are both more binding and often the barrier, should we be thinking about interventions that directly target men? Have you had experience with that? And, is that a kind of path forward that you think is an exciting one?
So I think Tarun Jain, Divadhar, and Seema Jayachandran have some work on kind of adolescent gender training programs in schools, and they have some very promising evidence that boys' attitudes change. So, that's one kind of evidence I've seen. Some of the other evidence I've seen actually, I haven't seen a lot of evidence that you can, directly target men. I would say the positive evidence from the work we did is we didn't see, and we tried to measure quite carefully, for instance, gender-based violence. We didn't actually see any rises in it. So We didn't see male backlash, and we did see in that particular case, over time, men's attitudes became more progressive. I think it would be great to think of targeting men directly. Another example I can think of is work in Saudi Arabia, saying that if there are these misperceived norms, and as I said, then certainly giving men information about what the actual beliefs are is important. In work we've done in Chhattisgarh, we didn't find a lot of evidence of misperception. Like it seemed like people's beliefs in the community were quite close to what actually men said. But I think that if it's true is certainly low-hanging fruit that you would want to get at.
So we've had a couple of questions about kind of the political side of this. And since you said a nice thing about political scientists, I had to kind of follow up on that opening that you provided. But I think, one of the things, because you've done so much work with policymakers at different levels, there has been, some effort by some political parties in India to kind of think about women as a political constituency, maybe at the local level, sometimes at the state level. Have you seen, or do you have any hope that women's work can actually become something that is a political issue that parties see as potentially something to capitalize on? I mean, you mentioned the 30% of women who are housewives want work. If you're a politician, you might think of that as a constituency. And do you have any kind of evidence that was, at play or a possibility that might launch some of this forward?
So I think certainly the one thing, and my co-author Soledad Prillaman has thought, I think, much more about it, is what's happening with self-help groups in India. So I think her view is that they're in some ways getting co-opted by the state machinery right now, that they're becoming very much anything that needs to be done, let's do it through self-help groups, be it providing training, providing bank accounts, and now, often through COVID times, what you would do there. So one is that these sort of women's collectives are seen as the way of providing state services at a point in time when state capacity is very low in rural areas. I think we definitely see states doing that. And as we know, self-help groups have had a pretty political history, especially in South India, of, even during microfinance and otherwise. So I think that's one place you would see it. The other place right now, which I think is interesting, is what's going to happen to health. So I think, the Indian state has been very bad at investing in rural health. I don't know if that's going to change, but again, the rise of Anganwadi workers, of ASHA workers, these are large cadres of female workers. And maybe this comes to Milan's question a bit of, how do we provide work close to home? The problem is they're terribly paid, all of them. So I think the fear again is you're going to get women in the labor force, but as I said, for extremely important roles, but at low pay.
So that's interesting, and just gets to a final question before we wrap up, that a couple of people, Famida Handi and also another person had asked, is just that, you mentioned self-help groups for their political role, but the questions we had got was about the role of microfinance organizations, which obviously there's a lot of kind of literature and attention to. My sense is that some of your research has been a little bit more cautious about how much microfinance can help, maybe through its intended channel, but some of the notions of self-help groups, are you suggesting, are kind of helpful in a kind of political and organizational sense? Is that kind of how you see it? Or do you see a role for a kind of microfinance groups particularly that goes beyond this logic of self-help groups?
Yes, I think the other place where we've seen it work is the group meeting setting. So I think, in fact, that was something I remember some early anthropological work from Bangladesh brought out a lot, was that, this microfinance gave women a reason to leave their home, cross the village, meet as a group, improve mobility. So, I mean, again, thinking of financial inclusion, and, you can think of microfinance, you can think of these customer service points or bank sathis or bank sakhis that now states are doing. These are all ways of getting women to engage with the formal economy. And, to me, that was a huge, I know we didn't find huge effects on poverty, but I always think, not so long ago, if you told people that poor Indian women can repay loans and be credible borrowers, it would not have had an audience. And I think we don't give enough credit to microfinance for that.
By way of a final question, I think I'd like to, given that we've had a lot of people on this this webinar who are students themselves, and you referenced kind of one or two exciting areas for research in this, but I was wondering if you could just speak more broadly to, especially students who are listening in, about how they might think about doing research in this avenue. You know, for many of them, the opportunities of directly accessing policymakers or doing large randomized control trials are not available. So, you know, what are the ways in which they might get involved in this kind of research on topics like this? If you have, you know, kind of broad suggestions to them, I'm sure they'd welcome hearing them.
Yeah, no, first, thank you for those of you who've been listening in. I mean, I think in different ways, what is, I think, quite accessible is secondary data sets. So there are now several of them that you can actually directly download from, you know, the National Sample Surveys or the PLFS or other time use. It's just freely downloadable, which is great. What I would encourage people to use, and this is literally how I started on my PhD as well, is read newspapers on what state governments are doing. There is the governments in India are endless policy labs in terms of what they're doing. And then you just have to think, I mean, so just to hark back to a very long time ago when I did my PhD, I actually read in the coffee room about political reservation. And then literally it came from, I went to the Shastri Bhavan library, and this was, you know, the time when you had to kind of write things down by hand. You couldn't take computers, you know, there weren't very many computers around. So I think that's the one interesting part of working in India, is that the government is always implementing things. And, you know, now it's not just the number of states, it's the district officers who are innovating, it's the gram panchayats who are innovating. So I think that's one way of getting in. That's possibly, you know, you can do it without that many financial resources.
Well, thank you very, very much. We're over time already. I know we still have a number of questions, and I'm sorry to those of you whose questions were not asked, but we tried to get to as many of them as we can. Speaks to the interesting topic matter that you presented on, Rohini, that we had so many people wanting to engage further. And just it leaves me to thank everybody again who helped organize this event, especially the CASI staff for their tireless work in putting this together. Let me please again thank our distinguished speaker, Rohini Pande. Thank you for joining us virtually. We hope to have you back at CASI and at the University of Pennsylvania in person. Thank you to everybody who is listening in from across the world, and we hope to see you again at CASI events in the future. Rohini, thank you so much.
Thank you very much. It was great to be here. And I'd just say, if there were questions people had, you know, feel free to drop me an email. I won't be a fast replier, but I hope at some point in the next few weeks, I'll be able to reply to questions by email. So, and thank you, Tarek, very much for inviting me and leading this fascinating conversation.
Okay, thank you so much. Thanks everyone.